Okay, so this is section 7, part 7 of chapter 12, eukaryotic microbes. And this is, I'm going on to the second set of lecture slides, lecture 17, chapter 12, eukaryotes 2. And we're going to skip ahead a little bit. We're going to move on to section 12.5, multicellular parasites, the helminths. So helminth is one of those general terms, doesn't have any real classification meaning, but a helminth is simply a wormy-like animal. Look at identification, entry of helminths into the body, life cycles, and then some examples. So on to slide 2. Helminths include a wide range of different animals, and that's, I guess, the first point is to be made that helminths are animals. They have all the characteristics of animals. They are in the kingdom Animalia, just like humans are, and that's one reason why it can be very difficult to treat helminths, is because if you develop a drug that targets the worm cells are now practically identical to your own cells, so if it's going to be toxic to the worm, it's going to be toxic to you. We have nematodes, also known as roundworms. We have cestodes, which are known as tapeworms. We have trematodes, which are known as flukes. So these are some nematodes. This is a tapeworm. These are flukes living in a liver. They, at least the ones that harm us, are parasites. They invade our host tissues and they rob us of nutrients. So that's what a parasite does. Parasite is when two organisms live together. One is the parasite, one is the host, and the host is harmed and the parasite benefits. Many of these helminth infections are controlled in the industrialized nations, so in the first world. So once again, this is a case of third world countries, or the developed world, being primarily infected and impacted. So, number one, it's hard to make drugs that are effective against helminths but don't also harm the host. And secondly, these infections are in some of the poorest parts of the world. Another important aspect of these infections spreading is sanitation. A lot of these infections are spread they are spread in feces. A lot of these life cycles involve the worm getting into an animal host and then shedding feces, shedding eggs in the feces of that animal. And then the fecal material contaminates water and contaminates the land, and then the disease continues, gets into the animal host, reproduces, leaves the animal host through the feces, contaminates the environment, and there's the cycle for you. So where we have countries who don't have the money for sophisticated sanitization, we have potentially raw sewage getting on the land, we have raw sewage getting in the water, we have then the potential of raw sewage being dumped upstream or just dumped at the village, and then we have people getting their water from that same river. We have children playing in that river. We have places where there are no toilets. You have people going and relieving themselves on the soil, and then if they are infected with the helminth, that soil is now contaminated, and the next person who encounters that environment can be infected. So let's look at slide 3. Slide 3 are routes of entry of helminths into the body. So the first way we're going to look at helminths getting in, look at some examples of nematodes. And we'll look at what a nematode is a little bit later on. But a hookworm is, you may have heard of hookworms. That hookworms have been infecting Americans recently on beaches. People have been wandering around on the beaches barefoot. People have not been leaving the beaches to relieve themselves. And if someone who has hookworm relieves himself on a beach, the eggs are in the fecal material. The eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae wriggle through the sand, and then when the next person walks over contaminated sand, the larva will penetrate and burrow up through the skin. Once the hookworm larva is into your skin, it'll travel in the bloodstream. It will travel to the lungs. Once in the lungs, the worms will be coughed up, and they will then be swallowed, and then they'll make their way into the intestines. They'll mature into the adult stages. There are male and female worms. They will get together. They will have sexual reproduction, and the female will lay lots and lots of eggs. And then the eggs will be expelled in the feces. Another important way that helminth parasites can be passed around is in poorly cooked meat. So many of these parasites can kind of inject cysts into muscles. Cysts are just kind of one of the kind of resting phases, similar to a cyst that we saw in a protozoan. They're just kind of there to hang out and wait. For example, a pig eats some contaminated scraps of meat. The pig gets infected. The cysts are then placed into, or the worm then placed its cysts into the pig meat. And then a human eats undercooked animal meat. Particularly undercooked pork is important. And we ingest the cysts. The cysts can survive their journey through the acid of the stomach, and they hatch in our digestive tract, and the adult worms grow and they begin to mate. So through penetration through our skin and through ingestion, these are two important methods of helminths getting in the body. On to slide 4, another very important mechanism of these parasites getting into bodies is through biting insects. So another nematode, Wuchereria bancroftii, causes this disease. It's known as elephantiasis, and it is transmitted by mosquitoes. So again, there's a complex life cycle. The mosquito takes a bite. It takes this thing called a blood meal. In the blood meal, there are a stage of the worm's life cycle called a microfilare that gets into the mosquito. Inside the mosquito, the worm undergoes some of its life cycle, and this is an important distinction. The fact that the worm is inside the mosquito and that the worm is completing some of its life cycle stages inside the mosquito, that denotes the mosquito as a biological vector. There are two kinds of vectors in terms of say, flies. There are mechanical vectors and biological vectors. Mosquitoes are almost always biological vectors. The parasite requires the mosquito not just to transfer from point A to point B, it requires the mosquito to perform some of its life cycle changes. Then the mosquito bites the human again, and the human gets infected. What causes these unpleasant symptoms is that the worms wriggle through the body, and they wriggle into the lymphatic vessels. If you recall what the lymphatic vessels do, all of that fluid in the blood is pumped and it's lost into the tissues. And as the fluid washes through the tissues, much of that fluid is reclaimed back into the blood vessels, but a good portion has to be reclaimed by the lymph system, the lymphatic tissue, and then it's returned, all that excess fluid is returned to the blood later on. As these worms lodge in these lymphatic vessels, they block them up, and that means that the tissues can't drain. And all you see here is just the accumulation and the accumulation and the swelling of tissues as this reclamation system of the lymphatic vessels are blocked. Oops. So mosquitoes, very important. Biting flies, again very important. Another nematode, Onchocerca volvulus, causes this disease of river blindness. 18 million people affected each year. 250,000 are completely blind. 500,000 people are impaired. So again, the fly is a vector. It's also a biological vector. So it'll bite the person. The infectious forms of the worm get into the person, and in this case they migrate. They migrate particularly to the eye, and when they get to the eye, the damage is from the person's own inflammatory response. And in fact, it's not just the worm that we are responding against. The worm has in it a bacterial symbiont, so we are mounting an inflammatory response against the bacteria in the worm. It just happens to occur in a very delicate part of the body, leading to the unfortunate symptoms of river blindness. So on to slide 6. Life cycles. They can be very complicated. Often a helminth parasite requires multiple hosts. It requires one or more intermediate hosts, and then a definitive host. Let's look at the definitive host first. Probably might be easier to identify. The definitive host is where sexual reproduction occurs. So this is where the eggs are being laid. So take a look at this life cycle. This is the life cycle of Schistosoma mansonii, or mansoni. What we have in the human digestive tract, we have the adult worms. The adult worms are undergoing sexual reproduction. There's a male and a female worm, and they are laying their eggs in the human. The eggs are then being released in the feces. So in this case, the human is our definitive host. That's where the adults are reproducing. That's where the eggs are being laid. But we'll see that in order to complete its life cycle, Schistosomiasis needs snails. So the human waste gets into the environment. Another infective stage of the worm's life cycle penetrates the snails. Inside the snail, the parasite undergoes more of its life cycle steps. The life cycle, another infective stage in the life cycle called eukaryotes, they then exit the worm back into the environment, and in this case they penetrate the human via the skin. And then we have the completion of the life cycle in the human, the production of eggs in the waste, the reinfection of the snail. So we have this complete life cycle. So the human is the definitive host. That's where the adults are, that's where the sex is happening. The snails are the intermediate host. The worm, or indeed the parasite, needs them. It needs them to complete its life cycle so that the life cycle stages can get back into the human, and so that it can continue to make its eggs. Just like our brain-eating amoeba, there are many cases where humans are dead-end hosts. So humans have entered an environment where they were unexpected. But these infective stages of the helminth, they really can't tell the difference between a duck and a human. So if a human's splashing around in the water, it'll infect them just as well. But if the human does get infected, then the parasite is stuck. It kind of gets lost inside the human and it can't get out. So whilst the human is affected, the parasite is also affected in the fact that it will die and it won't be able to complete its life cycle. So swimmer's itch is when, for example, a human is in an infected environment and they get stuck by accident. So let's take a look at this life cycle. We have the duck getting infected with these eukaryotes. We have the duck producing eggs and releasing them in its feces. Or we have the parasites inside the duck laying the eggs, and then the eggs are released in the duck feces. We have the eggs hatching. We have the eggs infecting a snail. We have life cycle stages being completed in the snail. That makes then the duck our definitive host. That's where the eggs are being produced. And that makes the snail our intermediate host, required in the life cycle, and parts of the life cycle the helminth requires the snail to complete those life cycle steps. One of the ideas behind trying to control these diseases is then trying to control the intermediate host. If you can get rid of the snails, then the people can't get infected, because without the snail we don't have the infective stages of the helminth life cycle. And this is one reason why things like global warming or climate change are influencing the ability of these helminth diseases to spread, because these snails have a particular environmental conditions, particularly wet places, particularly wet, warm places. Another reason why many of these helminth diseases are found in the developing world, in the tropical regions, in kind of the equatorial regions. It's It's because that's where the snails live. And without the snails, you need the snails to have the disease. Okay, how do helminths get in? Hookworms get in via penetrating the skin. And then they go to, those of hookworms, they go to the lungs, they get swallowed into the digestive tract, they have sex and lay their eggs, and the eggs are then released in the feces. Bushraria bancroftii, causing elephantiasis, that gets in via mosquito bites. It then wriggles its way to the lymphatic system. It blocks the lymphatic system, and you get this swelling. Onchrossera volvulus, one that causes river blindness, that gets in by biting flies. River blindness because the flies are found along rivers. The infective stages in the bite of the fly get into your body. One of the targets, one of the places where they end up, is in the eyes, and then our body mounts a strong immune response against primarily the bacteria that are in the worm. And we've talked about the immune response being damaging immune response in a delicate part of the body causes the blindness. Be able to identify in a life cycle an intermediate host, a definitive host, and understand what a dead end host is.